19th wife, who was someone's 19th wife. And let me just tell you briefly about who she was, so I can set up the story of how I wrote that book. Her name was Annalisa Young, and she was born in the 1840s in Nauvoo, Illinois, which is where the Mormon Church was based at the time. And her parents were devout Mormons. They knew the founder of the church, Joseph Smith, personally, and they absolutely believed in his teachings. And they believed in his teachings so much that they had been among the first Mormon families to accept the doctrine of plural marriage, which was that plural marriage was part of one's salvation. And so Annalisa was born into this world and into this kind of family, and when she was an infant, her father took a second wife. And she grew up living with her mother and her mother's sister wife, and it was a fairly harmonious household that she grew up in. And in the later 1840s, the Mormons moved to Utah and established Salt Lake City, and her family went with them. And she had a fairly happy childhood in this kind of family. But then when she was 12, something happened. And you know, I have 3 sisters, and you know, 12 is a really impressionable age for girls. I think boys might be a little bit later, but she was 12, and her father went through what today we might call a midlife crisis, because in the course of 4 weeks, he went from having 2 wives to 5 wives. He brought home a pair of sisters and married them, and then another woman. And Annalisa, at the age of 12, watched her mother have to deal with this. And this was the kind of the first dent into her faith, into her understanding of what plural marriage could be and what kind of life that could be for her. And she saw her mother really struggle with this, but also accept it in the name of her faith. She grew up, and she was very beautiful, very articulate, and married the second leader of the church, Brigham Young, her spiritual leader, and became his 19th wife. And then after 5 years of marriage, she realized that she was no one's wife. And in her words, she realized she was basically, she wasn't even his mistress, she was basically a whore. And she had 2 sons, and she had 2 young boys, and she would look at them and think to herself, I'm teaching them to think that this is what marriage is, and that this is how a husband would treat his wives, and she didn't want that for her sons. And so over time, her faith began to crumble, and she decided she could no longer be in this marriage. But to leave that marriage meant leaving her church, her family, because her father still had 5 wives, her brother had 2 wives, her state, Utah, which was a territory at the time, just leaving everybody she knew and loved, and going out into a world that she really didn't know. Up until just a few months before this decision of hers, she'd never met a non-Mormon. That's how insular her life was. But she left Brigham, and it was huge news across the country. And this is sort of where I started finding her story, because people were very curious about Mormon polygamy at the time. And her story was on the front page of the New York Times, on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, and everywhere in between, because people wanted to know what was it like inside Brigham's household, how many wives did he have. People were just very curious about these questions. And she went and testified to Congress about her experiences of plural marriage, and went to the White House, talked to President Grant and Mrs. Grant about her experiences, and became a very important force in the anti-polygamy movement that led the Mormon Church to change its position on polygamy in 1890. And of course, they don't practice polygamy. They haven't since then, and don't today. And so that's kind of the story that professor gave me, more or less. And immediately, my ear was picking up on what the possibilities could be, because I was really drawn to this idea of somebody being born into a world and then breaking from that world, and the kind of courage it would take. And I also was, I sensed that she must be a very complex figure, given that she could break away from that world and not just leave it, but then in some ways turn against it in a very public and forceful way. So I was working on that other novel that I was telling you about, the one that was, not any fun. And I kept working on it. I don't know why I didn't listen to my instincts, but I kept working on it for a while, actually, and it got less and less fun. And then one night I literally just sat up in bed and said I should be working on The 19th Wife, and I made that decision and I never looked back. And what I started to do was to really look into who she was, because I wanted to understand what kind of woman could make these decisions. And she was really, really famous in her day, so it actually wasn't very hard. And the newspapers covered her, the newspapers in Utah and then elsewhere, and she went on a 10-year lecture tour talking about her experiences in big towns and small towns across America, and everywhere she went, the local paper covered her story. So I could trace her around the country and read what she was saying and read what she was saying to people about her experiences. And it was just beneath the surface. It actually wasn't very hard to find. And a lot was written about her. But after about sort of 6 months of doing that kind of research and figuring out who she was, I could answer the question of, tell me a little bit about The 19th Wife. I could give you a biographical story about her. But that's not what fiction is. And I was having trouble with, a more important question, not really who she was, but really what was it like to be her. And as much as she said about her experiences, and she wrote 2 books, and her, her testimony to Congress, and all these lectures, and her public interviews, as much as she was kind of a showboat, in fact, as much as she talked about herself, she avoided some really important subjects. She really didn't explain at all what her inner life was like. She either she didn't know how to, or she wasn't inclined, because she had an agenda, which was to end polygamy. And so she proved to be not an especially thoughtful public figure. And that left sort of all sorts of room about like what did she really experience and what did she really think. And really the question that I wanted to know, and that I thought readers might want to know, was, what is it like to share your spouse with 18 others? What does that feel like? What does it mean to come home and see all those doors and know there's a woman and her small children behind every door, and there's a hallway that they lived in? Brigham lived in a house called the Beehive House, which was his offices and his home, and then across a patio was a house that was called the Lion House, and that's where some of his wives lived, and where the children and the wives ate. And then upstairs is this hallway, and it's like a hotel hallway with just door after door, and that's where they lived. And he would go and leave a check mark with a piece of chalk on the door of the woman that he wanted to see that night. But Annalisa never said, what did that feel like? And that's what I would want to know. And so I saw the hole in history that I could begin to fill by figuring out what it was like to be her. Not so much who she was, because that wasn't that hard to find, but really what was it like to be her. And so I was struggling with this question, and I was in Salt Lake City at the time, and much of those newspaper articles I was talking about were on microfiche. They're not online, and I was at the microfiche machine, and I'd been there for days, pressing that button and the reel, and my eyes were glazing over once again, because I wasn't getting anywhere with that bigger question. And then it popped into my mind, this research of how to tell the story. I was asking myself that question, and I got this idea. I said, what I need to do? I need to talk to some people. I can't just look at these archives and these microfiche. I need to talk to some people. And who I actually need to talk to are some plural wives. I need to talk to some women who live in a plural marriage and ask them about their experiences. And so I just had this idea that I would go down and find some, and that so I got in my rental car and drove to southern Utah, to the border of Utah and Arizona, a very remote part of the desert, a part of the desert where you really aren't going to drive by or through. There's no reason to be in that area. And in that remote part of the desert is a community that's fairly well known now called Hilldale, Colorado City, which is where Warren Jeffs is from. And that community is way out in the desert, not on any major road for a reason. They want to be left alone. And I thought I would go down to that community and, you know, strike up some women on the street kind of interviews. And I was sure of it as I was driving down. And I just had, you know, the tools of writing are your pen and your notebook and maybe your recorder, and that's all I thought I needed. And so I pulled into this community and immediately realized I was in some place unlike any other place in the United States. I think that one of the reasons that got me to that moment of driving into this community is that obviously I was fairly naive. But I'm looking back at it, I'm glad I was naive, because if I had overthought it and if my analytical part of my mind had stepped in, I would have said that's the dumbest idea in the world. And I wouldn't have done it. But I think to write fiction, you have to be a little bit naive, because you have to be open, and you can't have your mind shutting you down before you've thought things through or looked around corners that other people might say are empty. And so that naivete led me to this moment of pulling into this community and quickly, you know, sort of getting a sense of just what it looked like. And what I saw were very large houses, sometimes 2 or 3 together in a compound surrounded by walls, and that these were homes clearly that could be home to 40 or 50 children and 8 or 10 wives and 1 man. And but there really weren't any people around. I saw a few women working out in a garden, and that didn't seem like a likely place for my woman on the street interview. I went to what is the center of this town. There's not really much actual center, and there's a post office, a gas station, kind of a little bit of a store, and then there's a supermarket, a small supermarket, and that was where the activity was that afternoon. And the market parking lot, trucks coming in and out and getting out of those trucks were women, 3 or 4 women together, sister wives, out doing their grocery shopping with some of their kids. And so I thought, well, this is the place. Let's go. And so I walked into the market, the sliding glass doors opened up. You know, I had my notebook, and I immediately, as I walked through those glass doors, everybody in the market knew I wasn't from there. But they just politely went about their business. They went about their shopping. Nobody at all made me feel unwelcome in any way. They just looked the other way and, you know, picked out their groceries. Except for one little boy. And he was about 7, and he just locked his eyes on me. He just kept his eyes on me and really paid attention to where I was in the market. And I could see in his eyes, you know, when you look in someone's eyes and you're pretty sure of what they're thinking, it was one of these moments. I could see that he really understood that I was from someplace different, and that was registering with him in a profound way. And I began to think about these large houses that I was just describing, and then thinking about this particular little boy in there, and what his life might be like with maybe 40 siblings, and what his life would be like watching his mom maneuver her marriage with 7 other sister wives, and what it would be like for him to watch his mom try to get time with his dad and what it would be like for him to want and ask for affection and time from his dad, who had maybe 30 or 40 other children.